Some of these biennials are just waiting to pop. They're just waiting for conditions, and once they break dormancy, they just shoot out a flowering stem, and they're just going to bolt, and they're going to start growing tall, tall, tall. Now, it's okay for them to be 6 or 12 inches tall, maybe 6 to 10 inches when you plant them out, but you don't want something that's 18 inches tall. Welcome to the Seed Farmer Podcast, the podcast where I want you to harvest seeds from some of the vegetables and flowers growing in your farm or garden, and then to plant that seed out to grow delicious vegetables and beautiful flowers. If you enjoy the Seed Farmer Podcast and find it to be a good resource that helps you improve your seed work and farming, please support the show at spreadsheet.farm/support-podcast. The link is also in the show notes. I'm your host, Dan Brisebois, seed grower at Turnisol Cooperative Farm and author of The Seed Farmer, a complete guide to growing, using, and selling your own seeds. Today, we've got another minisode. And this minisode is all about unexpected seed opportunities in your cold room. Now, I've chosen this episode because often when I talk about seeds on the podcast, I'm talking about, the season coming up and you're thinking about what open pollinated varieties you have in your seed order already, and maybe you could add them into your farm, intentionally grown for seed, or maybe thinking about varieties that you rely on, that you want to do some selections on. But there's another way that you can grow seed, is just what could you grow seed from right now? And one of those things is the roots that are in your cold room. You've done essentially the first year of a biennial, and so you could get ready for year 2 of the biennial. And just a quick biology lesson, a biennial is a crop that in the first year will grow a taproot or a storage root, and then over winter, outdoors or maybe in your cold room, and then the second year it's going to use the energy from that taproot and put up a flower, which will then go to seed. And a tricky thing with biennials, well, they take 2 years, right? That's the tricky thing. So they require a lot of foresight, and for sure, you can plan some this year as a first-year biennial that you're then going to have as a second-year biennial the following year in 2027. But as I was saying, you already have roots in your cold room. I mean, maybe you have roots in your cold room. But if you have roots in your cold room, they could go into a seed crop. So I'm going to talk to you about a few of the different crops that you might have there and what you can do with them. One thing that I will say is it's good if these varieties are open pollinated seeds rather than hybrids. If you have an OP, an open pollinated variety, then definitely go ahead. If you have a hybrid, some of the roots might have some sterility involved, or they might just give you some funny results in the flower or the seed stage. But as long as you have some open pollinated in the mix, it's fine also having a hybrid in the mix. And also along those lines, you might not even know the varieties that you have. Maybe you've just bulked all your carrots together. And that's also fine. It doesn't really matter if you know the varieties. I mean, if you want to sell that seed as a named variety or use it as a named variety, yes, it matters. But if you're at the beginning of a breeding project or creating some diversity in a population that will then adapt to your farm, diversity is fine and wonderful. And so if you have a mix of varieties and a few of them are open pollinated and a couple are hybrid, that's not the end of the world. I'd rather they were all OP, but it's not the end of the world to have a few hybrids in there that you might not know which is which. The last thing to talk about is climate. I farm outside of Montreal in Canada. We can get into the field around May 1st, which is a couple months from now. You might be in a climate where maybe you're saying, oh, those crops have already sprouted in the field and it's on. So just adapt my recommendations to your climate. But these crops are fairly cold hardy. They can probably take some -2, -3, maybe even -5 or 6 weather outside. That's Celsius, of course. So Fahrenheit would be something like, like 20 Fahrenheit and up. Definitely like 28 Fahrenheit and up. But yeah, so just interpret my comments into your climate. All right, let's talk about some crops. So the one that I love the most of all of these, you're not supposed to have favorites, but we do, is going to be onions. If you have overwintered onions in your cold room, and whether they're starting to sprout or not, as long as they're not juicy and stinky, but as long as they're starting to sprout or not, you can take those and you can plant them. And you could plant them outdoors. You could plant them in a greenhouse. Onions don't take a lot of space. You can actually pack in them pretty close because unlike some of the things we'll talk about after, the flower tends to be just like one stalk or maybe a couple stalks with flowers. We'll actually plant them in our greenhouse. We'll do one row down the middle of a bed for weeding purposes, but we will pack the onions one after the other. So just touching side by side or like almost touching. And I would feel comfortable doing this 3 rows wide if it wasn't for the weeds. And, so we do them in a greenhouse because onions don't love humidity and we live in a humid climate. I know folks in our area who do grow them outdoors also. At that point, you have to be, well, let's not even talk about seed harvest. We're just getting the seed in the ground to then mature. So you can get your onions out pretty early. You don't have to do a lot extra other than just planting them. And most of them are going to sprout and produce seed. So that would be onions. Next up would be, do you have any turnips or rutabagas in your cold room? And now you might be thinking, is there a difference between the two? And maybe not in the way you use those words, but when I'm saying turnip, I'm referring to Brassica rapa. It's a smaller root than what I'm going to call rutabaga in a moment. It has white flesh and is delicious eaten raw. You can cook it also, but it's delicious raw. And a rutabaga is the Brassica napus species. They're bigger. They have yellow flesh. Yes, you can eat it raw, and maybe you like it, but they tend to be cooked. Raw is a bit intense as a flavor. So turnips and rutabagas, if you have those overwintered in your cold room, you can plant them out. What's fun is the two of them won't cross. They're different species. So you can actually grow them side by side and you don't have to worry about crossing. Now, one thing about these roots, and this is going to be true for some other roots that I'm going to talk about, is that when you harvested it in the fall, if you cut the leaves down really, really tight with the root, kind of just shave them down, then you may have damaged a growing point and leaves might not start growing and it might not make it. But if you have a little bit of green that you left on it, or if you start to see green already in the cold room, then you have a good chance of getting a seed crop off of this. Now, what I'm going to suggest for all these crops, and you could do with onions, but I don't find it's as useful with onions, is that so you'll choose your roots that you're gonna propagate for seed, and then you could plant them in your greenhouse in a crate, or we'll actually plant them into 3-inch pots, and we'll start them in the greenhouse so they have a chance to break dormancy in the greenhouse, and therefore we see which roots are actually alive and which roots are just potentially rotty messes down the line. So starting them in the greenhouse, they break dormancy and they'll start to sprout up and make leaves, maybe even start to bolt. And so you can then plant only the ones that have broken dormancy in the ground and compost the others. And so starting this way in the greenhouse actually gives you a couple weeks advance. So we'll start our overwintered roots in the greenhouse around mid-April, and we'll plant them out May 1st, so that's about 2 weeks. So we'll have a little bit longer season because of that. And then we plant the right roots. But I don't like to do more than 2 weeks. Some of these biennials are just waiting to pop. They're just waiting for conditions. And once they break dormancy, they just shoot out a flowering stem, and they're just going to bolt. And they're going to start growing tall, tall, tall. Now, it's okay for them to be 6 or 12 inches tall, maybe 6 to 10 inches when you plant them out, but you don't want something that's 18 inches tall. It's going to be more vulnerable to wind, more vulnerable to drying out, more vulnerable to just being damaged. So I really don't want them to be started too early in the greenhouse. And I'm telling you this from firsthand experience of regretting having started them too early. There's always the chance that when it comes time to plant out, that it's too wet to plant out. That's another risk, but don't start them too early. So we're talking about turnips and rutabagas. You can choose your roots. And if you have a number of roots that have overwintered, well, choose the roundest roots. Choose the roots that have the vividest colors. Choose the roots that have the nicest taproot on the bottom. You can do a little selection at this point, and it's going to make a difference. You've already chosen what you think were the better roots to overwinter. So you've already done a selection inadvertently in the fall. And this is just your next selection that you're going into. Now, you can plant more than one row per bed. Same way that I said with the onions. And I guess I'll just say this for all the crops I'm doing now, I'm talking about now, we grow them one row per bed at this point, and it's just so that it's easier to weed. When you have 2 rows per bed, especially if you trellis the flowers to stand up, it is just so hard to keep them weed-free. And that's really what makes a farmer happy, is to not have to worry about weeds, to keep them under control, and to not lose your crop to that. So we'll do 1 row per bed, and I'll plant them something like a foot apart in the row. I'll also treat overwintered winter radishes pretty much the same way. So those are our brassicas. And yes, winter radishes won't cross with turnip or rutabaga. Now, let's talk about a couple other roots. Then there's beets that you might have. So beets, again, you want to make sure that they're not cut too flush with the top, so there's a growing point. You want to make sure there's a nice taproot. If the root is damaged, they might not take off. So beets are in the Betta vulgaris species. Chard is also in the Betta vulgaris species. So if you accidentally had some chard overwinter in your field, or maybe you've intentionally overwintered in your field, if the pollen from those chard plants gets over to your beet plants, there will be some cross-pollination. Maybe not the end of the world for leafy greens, for the chard part, but for the roots, you're not going to be too happy with that. So just make sure that if you have any overwintered chard, that you don't have that crossing in with your beets. But cross all those different beets up together if you want. And with beets are one of the roots that have a really big plant afterwards. I mean, you could do them 1 foot apart, but especially if you're doing 1 row. If you're doing 2 rows, that might be too much. But one row, you could do them 1 foot apart, maybe 1.5 feet, maybe even 2 feet. You'll see those are really, really big plants. And I like to trellis them, but they can get so unruly that it might not be feasible. So those are beets. And then the other root that you likely have in your cold room is carrots. Carrots are interesting. Similar to the other roots I've just talked about, you want to make sure you don't have a damaged growing tip on the top for them to take off. But the taproot isn't that important. In fact, you could eat half of that root and still plant it, and it would still take off. So that's something that's interesting about those. You could plant your carrots, I guess 1 row per bed if you're doing like me and trying to avoid or trying to improve weeding conditions. But you can plant them fairly close together, 6 inches, a foot apart. One of the things about carrots is they're going to put up a lot of umbels, but not all seed people will harvest all the umbels. It's really that first umbel. So when I say umbel, it's kind of the flower. That first umbel is what people love the most. Maybe your secondary umbels. The tertiary and quaternary, is that what you said, the 3rd and 4th? Those other umbels, the seeds get smaller and smaller, and a lot of growers just don't even worry about those. So growing them tight together lets you prioritize the first umbels to come off of each plant. Now, it's true for the other roots also, but it's especially true for carrots, is if you have any wild relatives in the field, you could have a crossing problem. And with carrots, you have Queen Anne's lace, wild carrot in certain areas. Like on our farm, we do have Queen Anne's lace around. So this is definitely a potential crossing problem with our carrots. This is something where maybe if you started in a greenhouse a month beforehand, you might be able to beat the flowering wild carrots, but not necessarily. So just be aware of your wild relatives. And I guess that's like wild radish might be a little bit more common. If you were doing parsnips, which are similar to carrots, wild parsnip is a problem. So just that's an extra thing to think about. But all these crops, carrots, beets, turnips, rutabagas, onions, you just might have in your cold room already. And So onions, you don't have to worry about the growing point. If you got nice onions, grow them. If there's other ones that you'll have to worry about the growing tip. And it's just basically, you got a biennial there. And what's really fun is you don't have to be waiting for that second year. You could just go into it. In an ideal world, you'd probably be planting a couple hundred, or maybe at least 80 of these roots out to get a good population, to avoid inbreeding depression, to have some nice diversity, all those things. But really, if you just grow 6 or 10 of these roots, you're still going to get a seed harvest. It's coming out of, like, the person who grew the seed initially probably had a large population. So this first generation that's a bit smaller isn't going to cause a big problem. And you might still get a lot of seed. Now, 10 or 15 plants of onions could be a bit of seed. Turnips, it might already be something interesting. You might even get like a quarter pound, maybe bigger. I can't really remember the yields off of that. But beets, you might, off of 10 or 15 plants, you might still get a few pounds of beet seed off of that. And the price of beet seed, or some varieties at least, can be quite high. So even a couple pounds might make a difference on your farm the next year. Got to make sure it germinates. There's a cleaning to do and all that. But you can deal with that later in the season. Maybe we'll do a podcast episode about following up on this. Anyway, there are unexpected seed opportunities in your cold room. So when you finish this episode, if you haven't already, run out to your cold room, go look at the roots, choose 10, 20 of the nicest ones, and put them aside if you're in a climate like mine to start in mid-April. If you're in a warmer climate, maybe go plant them in the ground already or in the greenhouse and tell me about it. Anyway, so that's today's minisode. Go out and plant some roots. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you to Sophia Sedelton for the theme music. You can hear more of their music at sophiasedelton.com. Thank you to Molly Breezebois for editing this episode, and thank you so much for listening. You can find more seed growing resources on my blog at seedgrowers.farm. While you're there, you can subscribe to my newsletter full of seed, growing, crop planning, and farm spreadsheets. You can also find out where to order a copy of my book, The Seed Farmer, a complete guide to growing, using, and selling your own seed. And you can support the podcast at spreadsheet.farm/support-podcast. If you haven't already subscribed, now's the time. You wouldn't want to miss the next episode. Until then, happy farming.